What if I told you that one of England's queens died not because she was guilty, but because she was young, because she was pretty balanced, and because the men around her decided she was no longer useful? What if I told you that her death was written in the same moment she became a bride, and all she ever did, from start to finish, was try to survive? You've heard the story. The silly girl who giggled too much. The reckless queen who dared to cheat on a powerful king. The teenage bride who ended up on the scaffold, beheaded like a common criminal. Her name was Catherine Howard. But that story, that's the polished, sanitized, history book version. The truth is so much worse. Because Catherine Howard didn't just die. She was fed to a machine built from royal ambition, courtly lust, and the cold, sharpened steel of the Tudor throne. Born around the year 1524, Catherine entered the world with a famous name, but no protection. Her father, Edmund Howard, was a nobleman in title, only poor, powerless, and always begging favors from richer relatives. Her mother died when she was still a child, and by the time she was 5 years old, Catherine was carted off like baggage to a sprawling, shadowy estate called Chesworth House, where the Dowager Duchess of Norfolk ran a finishing school for noble girls. Sounds proper, doesn't it? But behind the embroidered curtains and Latin lessons, predators waited. When Catherine was 12, her music tutor, Henry VIII, began touching her. When they were caught, the Duchess didn't strike him. She struck Catherine. Because a girl's honor was never hers to protect, it belonged to her family's name. It was a currency. And now, Catherine's value had dropped. It only got worse. At 14, she fell into the arms of another man, Francis Dereham, older, charming, and far too experienced. They called each other husband and wife and crawled into bed while the other girls giggled behind tapestries. But Catherine wasn't playing. She was being groomed, conditioned, broken down. By the time she was 15, her uncle, none other than the all-powerful Duke of Norfolk, saw her as a perfect piece on the Tudor chessboard. And when Henry VIII annulled his disastrous marriage to Anne of Cleves, the Duke placed young Catherine right in the path of a king who was desperate, angry, and more than twice her age. The king was nearing 50. Catherine was maybe 16. And from the moment their eyes met, she was doomed. 16 days after the annulment, they were married on the same day. Thomas Cromwell, the king's former right-hand man, was executed. Love and death, coronation and decapitation. That was Henry's way. That was the world Catherine was dragged into. And at first, it was all roses and rubies. Henry called her his rose without a thorn. He showered her with diamonds, lands, titles. He kissed her in public. He called her his salvation. But he only loved her because he thought she was untouched, pure. If he had known what happened in those dark bedrooms at Chesworth House, if he'd heard the panting giggles behind her closed doors, would he have ever crowned her? Then the past came back. Francis Dereham showed up at court, demanding a job, boasting about what he'd shared with the Queen. Then came Thomas Culpeper, the king's golden, favourite, handsome, dangerous, and utterly untouchable. He had been accused of rape and murder, and walked away smiling. That's the man who began writing to Catherine. What did you expect her to do? She was 17. She'd already learned what happened to women who said no. By autumn of the year 1541, the walls were closing in. Whispers swirled. Secrets leaked. And one man, Archbishop Thomas Cranmer, came forward with a story about Catherine's past. About her real past. Henry didn't believe it at first. How could he? His perfect rose. But the evidence stacked up like stones on a grave. And soon enough, Catherine Howard was screaming. Literally. On the night of November 7th, the guards came. Catherine broke free. She ran barefoot through the dark halls of Hampton Court, screaming Henry's name, begging to see him. Her fingernails scratched the wood. Her voice echoed through the stone. But the king had given orders she would never see him again. That hallway is still called the Haunted Gallery, and her story doesn't end there. They dragged her away, questioned her, stripped her title, locked her up, and then after months of torment on a grey, cold morning in February, they brought a block into her prison cell so she could practice her execution. She knelt on the wood, again and again, until she got her death speech just right. Because even with the axe waiting, Catherine Howard still wanted to please. At 9 o'clock, they carried her to the scaffold. Her legs wouldn't work. Her voice barely rose above a whisper, but she said what they wanted to hear. She said her punishment was just... And then, with one clean stroke, it was over. But death didn't silence her. Because Catherine's ghost is still running. Visitors claim they've seen her white dress, wild eyes, mouth open in a scream as she claws at the locked doors of Hampton Court, begging for mercy from a man who never listened. You want to call her foolish? You want to call her a whore? No. She was a child. She was a survivor. She was a queen who was thrown away like rubbish and left without a name, a grave, or a voice. But tonight, we're giving her voice back, because in part 2, you'll meet the real Catherine, not the queen, not the temptress, but the forgotten orphan girl, sitting alone in the dark corners of Chesworth House, already learning that in the Tudor world, love is a lie, and silence is safer than truth. Before she wore silk, before she danced in golden halls, before she felt the breath of a blade on the back of her neck, Catherine Howard was a little girl sitting on a stone window ledge, watching the shadows grow longer in a house, too big for silence, too cold for comfort. This was Chesworth House, the finishing school of noble girls, a place built not to raise daughters but to shape them into wives, obedient, pleasing, unblemished. It was not a home. It was a factory. She was barely 5 when they sent her away. Her mother was gone. Her father was nothing. The Howard name meant prestige. But names are heavy things when carried by a child with no coin in her pocket and no one to defend her. The Dowager Duchess of Norfolk took her in, not from love, but from duty. The girls under her care were instructed like dolls preparing for market. They learned Latin prayers and courtly graces. They embroidered roses with fingers that would soon be touched by kings. But no one taught them what to do when the men came in the night. Catherine learned that lesson early. Henry Manox was her music master, older, clever, and full of compliments that coiled around her like ivy. He told her she was special. He touched her hands when teaching her the lute. He brushed her hair away too often. And then, when they were alone, he pressed himself too close. It wasn't love. It wasn't even desire. It was the first demonstration of what men thought her body was worth. When they were caught, the Dowager Duchess slapped Catherine across the face so hard, she bled from the lip. Not him, not the man, the girl, because Catherine had already stepped onto the path from innocence to ruin. And in Tudor England, that path had no exits. She didn't cry, not in front of them, but she stopped laughing so loudly. She watched people more carefully. She started learning how to please, how to avoid punishment, how to smile when afraid. At 12, Catherine wasn't a child anymore, not in the eyes of the house, and certainly not to Francis Derham, the Duchess's secretary. He was older, bolder, full of the easy confidence of a man who knew what he could take. He called her wife. He brought her small gifts, whispered promises, and made her feel like she had control. But Catherine never had control. Not with him. Not with any man. The other girls at Chesworth giggled behind their hands when they heard the sounds from Catherine's bed. They thought it was love. They didn't see the way Derham's eyes tracked her like prey. or how his voice changed when she didn't obey. Catherine learned tricks to protect herself. She spoke proudly of how she knew how to touch and be touched without making a child. She thought it made her powerful. It only made her more vulnerable, because no one listened when girls like her screamed. So she learned not to scream. Still, she was beautiful, not in the polished, jewel-cut way of a princess, but in the wild way that made people turn their heads. She was short, graceful, with a laugh that spilled like wine and eyes too quick to trust. She danced. She flirted. She made people feel alive. Even then, she was playing queen in a house that trained girls to bow. When the Duke of Norfolk came calling, everything changed. He didn't ask her how she felt. He didn't speak of family. He looked at her as a tool, a name to be traded, a flower to be offered to a king rotting from the inside. Catherine didn't have dreams of love. She had only the memories of Manox's hands and Derham's weight, and the way the Duchess had looked at her with cold, disappointed eyes. So when they told her she would go to court, when they said she would attend Queen Anne of Cleves, that she would wear silk and be seen by kings, Catherine did not ask why. She packed her things and smiled. That was what girls did. They smiled. She arrived at court in a dress that was too tight at the waist and too thin for winter. But she stood straight. She was still a child. But no one saw that. The men at court whispered. The women observed. The king graying, limping. Angry noticed her immediately. It was December of the year, 1539. She was maybe 15. He was nearly 50. When she curtsied, he looked at her like something he could finally eat. At first, it was distant. He sent gifts. He sent glances. But soon, he was circling like a hawk. And when his marriage to Anne of Cleves collapsed, no one was surprised that Catherine Howard was chosen next. They say she was ambitious. They say she wanted to be queen. But ambition implies agency. Catherine didn't scheme her way to the throne. She was given to the king like a feast. And what choice did she have? Say no, and she would be ruined, cast out, forgotten. Say yes, and she would wear a crown, bring her family honor, and maybe, just maybe, be safe at last. She chose what she always chose, survival. But Chesworth House never left her. The sounds, the hands, the lies whispered in the dark. They followed her into every chamber, into every silk-covered bed, into the very heart of the palace. And so when Francis Derham reappeared, when he walked into her life again and began to speak of their past, demanding favors, threatening secrets, she didn't run. She gave him a job. She tried to contain the fire before it burned down everything, but it was already too late. Catherine Howard never stood a chance. Not in Chesworth, not in court, not in the world of Henry Tudor. She had been raised in silence, trained in obedience, and crowned in fear. And in part 3, we will watch as the trap begins to close slowly, subtly, and with a smile. A new man enters the game. His name is Thomas Culpeper, and he won't ask Catherine for her heart. He'll demand something else. And this time, saying no might just kill her. The summer sun of the year 1541 burned white across England, and yet Catherine Howard shivered, even at the height of her glory, surrounded by gold, silks, and courtiers who called her Your Majesty. She could not shake the cold she had carried since childhood. It crept through her bones like a memory, whispering that happiness was always borrowed. That warmth was always taken back. But the king did not see that. Henry only saw youth, his own fading, reflected in her laughter. He was old now, swollen with sickness, his leg ulcered and leaking through the bandages. Every smile from Catherine was a kind of medicine, and every touch, a lie she had to tell to survive another day. It should have been a dream. A queen at 16. Jewels heavy on her throat. Courtiers bowing as she passed. But the palace was full of ghosts, her own among them. Francis Derham had found his way to court. He carried her secrets like a dagger beneath his coat. He spoke of their nights at Chesworth, hinting, boasting, daring anyone to question him. Catherine could not breathe when he entered the room. He wanted power, he wanted money, and he wanted her silence. So she gave him what he asked for. She made him her secretary, hoping that if she fed the wolf, he would not bite. It was her first mistake as queen, but not her last, because there was another wolf, one she didn't see until he was smiling at her. Thomas Culpeper was everything Derham was not. Younger, handsomer, with the kind of face that made women lower their eyes and men raise their guards. He moved like he owned the air around him. He was a gentleman of the king's privy chamber, close to power. Untouchable. Dangerous. But beneath the fine clothes and polished words was something dark. Court whispers told of how he had forced himself on a servant's wife, how he had killed a man who tried to stop him. The king pardoned him both times. It was said Henry laughed when he did it. A man like that, the king once said, should not be wasted on a noose. And now that man was staring at Catherine. He began with letters, polite and flattering, the kind that a young queen could not refuse without insult. Then came requests, small meetings, private talks, favours. Jane Boleyn, Lady Rochford, the widow of George Boleyn and sister-in-law to the executed Anne, became their messenger. Perhaps she pitied Catherine. Perhaps she was bored. Or perhaps she saw the same opportunity she had once used to destroy Anne. No one ever knew what she truly wanted. But she carried the letters, arranged the meetings, and closed the doors. Imagine Catherine, in those moments 17 years old, sitting in candlelight, the air thick with fear and perfume. She is not in love. She is trapped. Culpeper leans ein, his voice low, his hand heavy on her wrist. He reminds her who he is, the king's favourite, the man who can speak to Henry's ear or whisper to his enemies. Catherine smiles. She always smiles. She tells him what he wants to hear. It is how she has survived every man before him. She writes him a letter. It makes my heart die to think I cannot always be in your company. Historians would call it a love letter, but they never saw the tremor in her hand, or how the ink smudged from her tears. It was not passion, it was appeasement. Every word, a prayer that he would stop pressing closer. Every phrase a plea not to be destroyed. But there were eyes in every corridor, and ears behind every door. Servants whispered. Guards noticed patterns. The king's progress that summer took them across the shires. A moving court that left gossip in its wake like footprints in mud. Somewhere between Lincoln and York, one of those whispers found the ear of a man who loved nothing more than righteous cruelty. Archbishop Thomas Cranmer. He began to collect stories. Quietly, carefully. He listened to old servants of the Dowager Duchess, who remembered Catherine's youthful indiscretions. He found one woman who had seen Derham sneaking into Catherine's room. He took notes. He waited. Meanwhile, Henry was radiant in his delusion. He believed himself reborn by love. He called Catherine his blessing sent from heaven. He gave her lands, jewels, and titles for her family. She smiled beside him, her face pale beneath the weight of false joy. Each night, as he kissed her cheek, she felt the ghosts crawling closer. In those nights, when the court slept and only the wind moaned through the tapestries, Catherine would lie awake, staring into the darkness, wondering which would come first, the truth or the axe. She had grown used to fear. It had been her shadow since she was a child. But now, for the first time, she could feel its hands on her throat. Autumn came. The king ordered festivities for All Saints' Day. The air at Hampton Court was full of incense and secrets. And then, without warning, the trap snapped shut. Cranmer delivered a sealed note to Henry's private chapel. Inside was every detail of Catherine's past. Henry Minox, Francis Derham, the nights at Chesworth, the rumours of Culpeper. He described her as corrupted from her earliest youth. When Henry read it, the candlelight trembled. His hand shook. Then he laughed. Loudly. Too loudly. He said it was nonsense. Lies. But the laughter did not last. He called for proof. He demanded witnesses. And the more he demanded, the more truth came crawling forward. The courtiers began to avoid her eyes. Servants went missing. Jane Boleyn grew pale. Derham was arrested first. He broke quickly. Under questioning, he confessed everything. Then they dragged Culpeper in chains. His beauty meant nothing in the Tower. He spoke softly. But his words were enough. He had met the Queen. He had her letters. He had touched her. That was all Henry needed to hear. And somewhere, in a chamber draped with velvet, Catherine realized the truth that every Tudor queen learned too late once the king's love turned to anger. Not prayer. Not Lear. No beauty could save you. It began with a creak in the floorboards. Just after midnight, the guards outside the Queen's chambers stiffened. Not because of what they heard, but because of what they didn't. No laughter. No soft harp strings. No footsteps pacing in nervous silence. Just the dead weight of fear, pressing against the velvet walls like a fog that wouldn't lift. They had orders: keep the doors locked. Let no one out. Speak to no one. Inside, Catherine was still awake. She hadn't slept since the first whisper reached her ear. Since the moment she noticed how the women around her no longer smiled as they dressed her. How the men bowed too low. Or not at all. Derham was gone. Culpeper was gone. Jane Boleyn no longer mid her ice. She was alone now. Not the poetic, tragic loneliness of a girl spurned by love, but the crawling, festering isolation of someone marked for death and too young to understand how thoroughly the world could turn. She waited for Henry. Every footstep in the hall was his. Every creak of wood. Every echo of voices outside. Every bird scratching the window at dawn. She convinced herself it would be him. She would fall to her knees. She would beg. He had forgiven others. He had forgiven worse. Hadn't he? But the king never came. And on the 7th of November, in the year 1541, the silence shattered. When the guards approached, they didn't announce themselves. They didn't knock. They moved like executioners do, quiet. Practiced. With hands that had done this before. Catherine saw the shadows before she saw the men. She ran before they said a word. No shoes. No robe. Just a thin linen nightgown. Damp at the hem with cold sweat. Her hair, once threaded with jewels, clung to her neck in wild dark strands. She burst from her chamber, with a cry that turned to a scream halfway down the corridor. She shouted his name, Henry. Henry. Henry, over and over. Not as a queen calling to her husband, but as a girl screaming for someone, anyone, who might still love her. She knew he was in the chapel. She knew the route. She had taken it before. Laughing, trailing maids behind her like ribbons. But this time, the hallway swallowed her whole. The floors were stone. The walls too high. The candlelight flickered against tapestries that stared back at her with mute, regal judgment. She ran barefoot, skin slapping against the cold. Smooth slabs, breath tearing out of her lungs in sharp gasps. Her screams echoed. No answer. The guards behind her did not shout. They didn't need to. They knew where the door ended. She did not. The chapel doors were locked. He had locked them. Whether Henry sat inside with his face in his hands or turned his back to the sound, no one ever knew. But the order had been clear. She was not to be seen. She was not to be heard. Catherine reached the door and pounded with both fists. Her voice cracked from screaming. She fell to her knees, pressed her palms against the wood, and begged. Her fingernails clawed at the panels. She cried until there was nothing left in her throat but silence. And still, no answer. The guards caught her in that pose, kneeling at a locked door, drenched in sweat and shame, her arms trembling. When they seized her, she did not resist. When they dragged her back down the hall, she left streaks on the wall, scratches, deep and broken, torn from her nails as they pulled her away. That hallway has never healed. Today they call it the Haunted Gallery. Visitors report a chill that never lifts, a pressure in the chest, as if someone is still screaming nearby. Some say they've seen a white figure racing down the corridor, barefoot and wild-eyed, reaching for a door that no longer exists. Others say they've heard the name Henry whispered over and over in a voice not quite of this world. Catherine was locked in her chambers after that. Under armed watch. No priest. No family. Not even a lady-in-waiting who dared speak above a whisper. Her room became a tomb long before the scaffold was built. They removed her crown, her rings, her seal, each object stripped away like peeling skin, until only the frightened child beneath remained. She was no longer a queen, just a prisoner with soft hands and no voice, waiting for men to decide what she deserved. She didn't eat. She didn't sleep. She just stared at the wall. Sometimes she whispered to herself. Sometimes she wept so softly the guards thought the sound was in their heads. When the Privy Council summoned her, they described her as in such heaviness and lamentation as was never seen in any creature. She confessed everything, but not the way the council wanted, not with cunning or manipulation. She spoke like a child who had broken a rule she didn't understand. She said yes. Henry Mannix had touched her when she was 12. Yes. Francis Derham had used her body like a husband would. Yes. She had written letters to Thomas Culpeper. Yes. They had met, and then she waited for forgiveness that never came. Because in Henry's court, there was no confession without execution. There was no truth without blood. And the girl who had begged at a locked chapel door now knew how her story would end. The first frost of winter crept over London like a slow death. The gardens at Hampton Court wilted to grey. The fountains froze, midstream. And in the high rooms where the air stank of wax and fear, Catherine Howard stopped asking questions. There was nothing left to ask. The guards who brought her food never looked up. The maids who once brushed her hair now crossed themselves before entering. Even the bells seemed to ring from a different world, the world of the living. They called it house arrest. But the walls of her chamber were thicker than any cell. The fire was allowed to burn. But it gave no warmth. She sat near it for hours, staring into the orange coals, whispering words no one could hear. She still imagined Henry's face. She still believed he might forgive her, because that was what she'd been taught since childhood. If you behaved well enough, if you were gentle enough, if you pleased enough men, someone would eventually be kind. But no one came. At Sion Abbey they took her next. Far from the laughter of the court, it was a soft prison, cloaked in the pretense of piety, the sort of mercy that made cruelty look civilized. The nuns prayed for her soul. She prayed for sleep. The window of her room faced east, toward the city, toward the river that carried whispers of executions, coronations, plague, and gossip. Every morning, she watched the light shift from grey to white, wondering if that day would be her last. They told her Derham and Culpeper had confessed. They did not tell her the truth, that confession meant torture first. That iron hooks and hot tongs pried the words from them, that they had begged for death long before it came. The news came in fragments softly spoken by frightened attendants who thought pity might earn them favour in the next life. Derham was hanged, drawn, and quartered. his body torn into 4 pieces. Culpeper, being the king's former favourite, was granted the mercy of the axe. Their heads were set on spikes above London Bridge, where crows gathered to feast. When Catherine asked where the river turned red that morning, no one answered. The bill of attainder followed soon after. She was condemned without trial. The parchment listed her sins like a market inventory: wantonness, adultery, treason. The men who read it aloud wore black gloves, so her shame would not stain them. The same men who once bowed before her, who once flattered her perfume and her laughter, now could not meet her eyes. Henry did not attend. His leg was swelling, his temper rotting. They said he called her a filthy whore. They said he swore to erase her name. They said he wept. Perhaps all 3 were true. Perhaps none of them were. Kings are strange creatures when their hearts are involved. Catherine's own heart had grown quiet. She asked for paper and ink. They denied her. She asked for her Bible. They hesitated. She asked for peace. No one knew how to give it. On cold nights, she walked in circles around her chamber, tracing the stone with her fingertips, murmuring fragments of hymns from her childhood. Sometimes she laughed suddenly, startling the guards. Sometimes she sang softly in French, the songs she had learned as a girl. The sound of her voice frightened them. It didn't sound human anymore. It sounded like memory. When February came, the river froze. The ravens gathered along the parapets of the tower, waiting, clear as ever. Catherine was brought there by barge. She wore a cloak of white fur, the same one she had worn when the king first called her beautiful. The oars cut through ice and fog. She did not look up at the heads on London Bridge. She did not ask which belonged to Derham, which to Culpeper. She knew. The tower loomed above her, dark and ancient, its stones remembering every scream that had ever touched them. Inside, she was placed in a small room beneath the chapel of St. Peter ad Vincula, where the ghosts of queens and traitors shared the same air. There was straw on the floor, a single candle, and a wooden block in the corner. When she saw it, she smiled faintly as if greeting an old acquaintance. That night, she asked the guard if she might practice. He thought she was joking. She wasn't. They brought the block into her cell. She knelt before it, placed her neck across the grain, and whispered her last words over and over, until she could say them without trembling. "I, dear queen, but I would rather die the wife of Culpeper." That's what the legends say, but no one can prove it. What they can prove is that she practiced endlessly until her knees bruised and her voice gave out. She did it not from pride, but from terror, because the only thing worse than dying was doing it badly. When dawn came, the frost on the window turned to water. The bells tolled 9. They carried her up the narrow steps toward the scaffold, her body small inside the heavy cloak. The crowd was already waiting, silent, faces grey with cold. Catherine looked out once, just once, and smiled a faint, bewildered smile that belonged to no one. She said her death was just. She said she forgave all who had wronged her. She said nothing of Henry. One clean stroke, they say. The axe fell like a door slamming shut. The ravens lifted from the parapet, black against the pale winter sky, and somewhere inside the tower, in the quiet below the chapel floor, the girl who once ran barefoot through Hampton Court finally stopped running. The sound was brief, wood against flesh, steel against breath. A thud so final. It echoed only once, and then silence. Catherine Howard's life ended in a single, practiced motion, but her death did not. The executioner wiped his blade with a cloth. The priest mumbled a final blessing. The crowd began to murmur, to shift, to drift away like smoke in the wind. But Catherine remained, headless on the scaffold, her body sprawled beside the block she had kissed in the dark. And even in death, the court still had demands. No funeral. No ceremony. No stone. The girl who had worn a crown of gold was not given a coffin. They wrapped her in cheap linen, dragged her from the platform before the frost could set in, and carried her into the chapel of St. Peter ad Vincula, the place where traitors went to disappear. The floor there was stone, cold and pitted with the weight of centuries. Underneath it, a pit already waited. Nuname carved. No record written, only dirt, lime, and silence. They placed her beside the bones of Anne Boleyn, another queen accused of betrayal. Another woman Henry once claimed to love. The two were cousins in life. In death, they were sisters in obscurity. There was no marker, even the lowest thieves. The hung men from the Tyburn tree were given wooden crosses with their names carved in poor Latin. But Catherine, Queen of England, was lowered into the earth like a broken object. Quickly, unceremoniously, as if they feared that even in death she might speak. Years passed, then decades, then centuries. Her name faded from the lips of courtiers, then from the pages of history books, until only her sins remained distilled, twisted, recited like a rhyme. The foolish girl, the laughing whore, the one who danced and died. No one spoke of Chesworth House. No one whispered of Henry Manox's hands or Derham's threats. No one told the story of a girl who ran barefoot in a nightgown, screaming for a locked door to open. She became a lesson, not for kings, but for women. They taught her as a warning. Be silent. Be still. Be careful what you want, for wanting too much might cost you your head. Young wives in court were told to remember Catherine's end, that the crown may glitter, but the block waits behind it. And Henry, he moved on. He always did. By the summer of that same year, he was laughing again. By autumn, he was remarried. He married Catherine Parr, a widow older, educated, cautious. She knew better than to charm him. She obeyed. She survived. But sometimes, they said, when Henry passed the halls of Hampton Court at night, his steps slowed. Sometimes, they said, he paused outside the chapel. Perhaps he thought of her. Perhaps he didn't. Perhaps it was only the wind. The centuries did not forget. Even if the court did, stories began to grow like moss between the cracks of the stones. Maids refused to enter the haunted gallery alone. Tourists claimed to hear cries in the evening. Cold gusts moved through locked doors. The scent of rosewater lingered in rooms long empty. A figure young, Bull, barefoot, was seen running toward the chapel. Again and again. Always too late. Always unseen. Always unheard. In the year 1876, when repairs were made to the chapel floor, workmen uncovered bones small, scattered, crumbled to powder in some places. Lime had been poured over them long ago to speed their decay. They were impossible to identify. No one could say which were Anne's, which were Catherine's, or if the bodies had simply vanished into the soil altogether. Nothing remained but fragments. So they placed a marble plaque above the pit. A gesture, a guess, it reads her name. But it is not a grave. It is a placeholder for a story never fully told. A girl with no mother. A child who learned to survive by pleasing others. A bride who never chose her groom. A queen who ran barefoot through the dark, begging for the door to open. Catherine Howard is not a ghost because she died. She is a ghost because she was erased. And in the dark spaces of Hampton Court, she still runs not toward forgiveness, but toward something far more human. A name, a stone, a place where someone, at last, might say, she was here. The first death was the axe. The second was what came after, because there is a silence that arrives, not with mourning, but with design. a silence shaped by royal decree, chiseled into history by the men who stood to gain by forgetting her. Catherine Howard was not simply executed, she was unremembered, dismantled, folded up and tucked between the pages of England's history like a note too shameful to read aloud. After her body was lowered into the pit beneath the chapel, the court moved swiftly to clean up the scandal. Her portraits were taken down, her letters burned, her name removed from official records. Where she had once signed her title with delicate strokes, Catherine the Queen, there was now only a blank line. Her family? The Howards. Turned inward, pretending she had never risen to the crown. As if shame could be diluted by denial. Only one person did not pretend, Mary Tudor, the king's daughter. That was 19 when Catherine died, older than her stepmother, colder than most, and wiser than any of them suspected. She had once sneered at Catherine, resented her laughter, her beauty, her youth. But in the months after the Queen's fall, Mary grew quiet, thoughtful. She did not speak Catherine's name in public, but in private, she ordered masses, said for the soul of the young lady, once graced by heaven and left unguarded. She never specified the name. She didn't have to. In the countryside, the common folk whispered too. They remembered the Queen who had danced among them during summer progresses, who had smiled at their children and pardoned minor criminals. They remembered her not as a traitor, but as a girl with soft hands and sad eyes. Some swore they saw her reflection in the frozen Thames that winter, hair floating like seaweed beneath the ice. Meanwhile, Henry grew old. He married again. For the 6th and final time, Catherine Parr was everything. Catherine Howard had not been clever, careful, and fully grown. She read Latin in bed. She quoted St. Augustine at the King's Supper. She kept her past neatly folded in prayer books, and never left a door unlocked. But even Catherine Parr must have known, late at night, what the price was for being too soft, too trusting, too young. Henry aged badly. The ulcer on his leg festered. His temper soured. He grew fat, bloated, wheeled from room to room like a wounded god. He still referred to his dead wives now and then, in dreams, in fits of rage. He cursed Anne Boleyn. He praised Jane Seymour. But he never spoke of Catherine Howard. Not once. Some said he was ashamed. Others believed he had loved her more deeply than he dared admit, and that her betrayal, real or imagined, had cracked something inside him that never healed. Perhaps he hated her most because she reminded him of everything he had once been desired. Virile. Worshipped. Perhaps her death was not punishment, but an exorcism, a way to burn the memory of youth from his own decaying body. But Catherine did not go quietly. In the decades after her death, servants at Hampton Court began to speak of the White Lady. She came at night, always barefoot, always silent except when she screamed. They said she appeared in the corridor where she had once run, palms slapping the doors that no longer opened, her mouth wide with terror, her face wet with tears that never dried. The guards refused to walk the hall alone. Priests were called, blessings whispered, but still, she came. She became folklore, a lesson for children, a warning for noble daughters, and eventually, just a story. But stories have power, especially when they are soaked in blood. In the late 18th century, a writer anonymous, female, possibly a servant's granddaughter, wrote a fictionalized letter, titled, "From the Ghost of Catherine Howard." It was never published, but it passed from hand to hand among women in noble households, whispered at firesides, and written in the margins of diaries. The letter read, "They took my voice, but I have not stopped speaking. They buried my name, but I have scratched it on every wall they tried to seal. I do not haunt because I am vengeful. I haunt because I was forgotten. No historian ever traced the author, but the words survived. like she did. And when the chapel floor was finally opened in the 19th century, when workmen peeled back the stones and found the scattered bones wrapped in rotted linen, no names, no coffins. Some swore they felt a chill rush up their spine. Some wept. Some touched the floor and whispered, "I see you now." But the truth is, Catherine Howard never left. Her second death, the erasure, the deliberate forgetting, has never been complete. She is written now into books, into films, into ghost tours and reenactments. But none of those can capture her fully. Not the child who trembled in the schoolroom. Not the teenager whispering promises to survive. Not the queen smiling with a blade at her throat. Not the girl at the locked door. She died twice. But she will never vanish again. In the damp, dust-choked cellars of Lambeth Palace, where old ink turned to rust on parchment and forgotten scrolls curled in boxes tied shut with waxed twine, there lay a drawer, locked with no key, marked only with a faded seal, 3 lions, 1 rose, and the faint trace of a woman's name carved into the wood by someone with a trembling hand. For centuries it remained untouched, passed over by archivists and ignored by bishops, until one winter evening in the year 1884, a clerk searching for maps of Kent for a railway expansion opened it and found not maps, but letters small, folded, browned at the edges and stained with something that could have been water, could have been wine, or might have been tears, pressed into parchment long before the last Tudor king breathed his final ragged sigh. There were only 5, written in a hand that wavered between girlish loops and desperate, clenched lines. They were not signed by name, but by a symbol 2 curved C's mirroring each other, scratched gently in the margins where ink had once been forbidden to reach. The first was addressed to no one. It began with the words, "If I am to be judged. Let it not be by those who saw me only when I wore the crown." The rest of the letter unravelled, like a quiet scream, memories of the corridors of Chesworth House, of music lessons interrupted by hands that didn't belong, of nightgowns dirtied not by play, but by the stain of adult games played in the dark. She spoke not of love, but of confusion, not of betrayal, but of bargains made beneath the weight of fear, a child's attempt to survive by pretending to be older than she ever truly was. "I thought," she wrote, "that if I laughed loud enough, no one would hear me breaking." The second letter was thinner, the ink paler, the handwriting more careful. It was addressed to the man who called me his rose. In it, she spoke of the first time she saw him, not with awe, but with the practiced stillness of someone who had already learned to watch men closely. "You were not the first to call me lovely," she wrote, "but you were the first whose words came wrapped in power." She described the chill of his touch, how he kissed her hands with the same lips that had once condemned another queen, how he looked at her, not with passion, but with hunger for youth itself, and how every time he whispered promises of forever, she felt the edge of something cold grazing her spine, because in his world, forever was a word sewn to the gallows, and love a curtain behind which the scaffold was always waiting. The third letter was unsealed, its folds worn thin by years of rubbing against bone-dry vellum, and its tone less elegant, almost rough. This one was not addressed at all. It was a list of names: Henry Manox, Francis Derriam, Thomas Culpeper, Jane Boleyn, Agnes Tilney, Edward Seymour. No descriptions. No accusations. Just names scrawled in descending order, as if each one weighed more than the last. At the bottom, she had written, "There were moments I could have screamed, but the silence always bought me one more day, and I thought I would need all the days I could get." The ink had run there, and beside the final word, there was a single fingerprint smudged, but unmistakably shaped by the narrow tip of a woman's ring finger. The fourth letter was the smallest, no more than a torn corner of a larger sheet. but it held within it the most devastating line of all. I never wanted to be queen. I only wanted to be safe. There were no other words. The paper carried the scent of rosewater, et fin, brittle, almost gone, but still clinging to the fibers, like perfume on skin that refuses to wash away even after death. And the fifth was different. It was not a letter at all. It was a prayer, or something like it, written in French, in the delicate rhythm of a song she must have learned long before crowns and kings and betrayals and death. Je suis celle qu'on a oubliée. Mais je chante encore, I am the one they forgot. But I still sing. Beneath it, in English, one final line scratched into the parchment as if by a fingernail. You may bury me without name, but I will not be quiet. Historians dismissed the letters, of course, called them apocryphal, sentimental, likely fiction, no proof. They said, no signature, no seal, but they were kept anyway, not on display, not catalogued, just preserved, folded in linen, and placed behind glass in a small, locked drawer marked only Queen Consort, unverified materials. But some readers believed, some saw in the trembling loops and sudden downward slashes a girl who had never truly vanished, only waited for someone to read her in full, because Catherine Howard, for all the ways they tried to erase her, never stopped writing. Not with pen, with echo, with legend, with the way women in royal portraits after her always smiled a little less brightly, with the way every Tudor bride looked twice before trusting the hands that reached for her, and in the ghostly halls of Hampton Court, where the gallery floor still remembers the pounding of her bare feet, and the shadows bend unnaturally along the chapel wall. Catherine's story continues to unravel, not in the official ledgers or the gilded family trees, but in the breathless gap between the scream and the locked door, in the long hallway that leads not to salvation, but to silence. But she has learned, at last, how to speak from inside the silence. The years passed, not like waves, but like fog thick, clinging, without shape or mercy. And the name of Catherine Howard was spoken less with each century, reduced from scandal to trivia, from tragedy to costume, from flesh and breath to nothing more than a footnote tucked between wives numbered 5 and 6, a name in a list, a head among heads. And yet the stone floors of Hampton Court did not forget her footsteps. The wind in the haunted gallery did not forget her cry. And the chapel beneath which her bones were never truly found refused to fall silent, no matter how many times it was blessed, repaved, painted over, no matter how many centuries of prayer tried to drown out the echo of one final scream. There is a reason the legend survives, not because people believe in ghosts, but because they believe in injustice. Because deep in the soft marrow of memory, we all recognize a girl like Catherine, a girl who was told to smile when she was afraid, who was handed to powerful men like an offering wrapped in silk, who learned that silence brought survival, and obedience was the only language anyone truly listened to. And even when crowned, even when adored, even when wrapped in gold, she remained an orphan in every room, a child hiding beneath embroidery and titles, begging with her eyes for someone to choose her not as a bride or a symbol or a vessel, but simply as someone worth saving. They say she still runs, that at night, when the palace grows quiet and the air thickens just before dawn, the guards hear bare feet slapping against the floor quick, frantic, as if someone is being chased, not by a man, but by fate itself, and that her voice, when it comes, is not a wail, but a plea, not of rage but of hope, as if even now she still believes the door will open. The king will forgive her. The blade will be stayed, and she will be allowed to wake from the nightmare she never deserved to enter. But no one comes, and the door, Always. Always. Or remain locked. Some say the air turns cold in that hallway without warning. That you can feel a hand brush your sleeve even when no one is behind you. That cameras malfunction. Batterie drain. Candles gutter out the moment you speak her name. And yet when the staff are asked if they believe, most simply lower their voices and say, "There is something here that does not rest." She does not rest because she was never laid to rest. Not properly. Not with dignity. Not with the rights granted even to the lowliest criminal, for even they were given a cross. A name. A prayer. But Catherine was thrown into the earth like a broken mirror, and no one dared gather the pieces, because to name her was to admit she had been wronged. And in Henry's England, kings did not make mistakes, only martyrs. In modern times, they tell her story with velvet ropes and placards, with actors in costume, with guides who lower their voices for dramatic effect and point to the corridor with a flashlight and say, "And here, in this very hall, she ran for her life." And the tourists gasp, take photos, walk on, but the stones remain. And they are not fooled by new paint. They remember the sound of fingernails scraping against wood, the whispered prayers muttered into locked doors, the final breath caught between hope and horror, and what remains of Catherine, not a tomb, not a portrait we can confirm, not a letter in her own hand, signed with her full name, only stories, stories told in the spaces where the official record goes silent, in the moments when the court scribe's ink suddenly dries, in the edges of memory, where forgotten queens refuse to stay forgotten. And perhaps that is her last revenge, that though she was buried without a name, without a stone, without even the dignity of a last prayer, we still speak her name, not as a footnote, not as a cautionary tale, but as a question. What happens to the girls who are never taught they are allowed to say no? And in that question, she lives. Catherine Howard, Queen of England, child of no protection, bride of no choice, victim of too many hands, ghost of a locked door, still runs, not because she cannot rest, but because no one ever came back to open the door,